Welcome all to the seventh presentation of our Module 6, Effective Communication. This presentation will focus on providing an overview of social survey research tools. And our hope is that it will empower you to begin to expand your use of social research to inform your outreach campaigns. The length of time that we have for this presentation precludes us going into much depth on social research, but we hope to give you an introduction to the approach and the tools. Social sciences collect data from individuals to better understand differences, patterns, and trends among populations. Populations are simply groups of people of interest to the researcher. Sometimes you can gather data from an entire population of interest, but typically you must collect data from only a sample of that population, hopefully from a representative subset. The data received from the smaller sample of people is inferred onto the larger population. How well your sampling represents the population determines the confidence with which you can make generalizations and inferences from the sample to the whole. If you decided that you need to collect some additional data, there are two main types of social research. Quantitative research is focused on generating statistics and numbers based on the sampling group. This survey approach, which involves some sort of questionnaire, poll, or survey, can answer questions about percentages of the population with a given view or comparisons between populations. These surveys get at the what questions. Qualitative research is focusing on understanding the why. These methods involve some sort of interview or open-ended questions to provide case studies and the meanings of responses. Qualitative research can be through a one-on-one interview, a focus group, or a community forum. Some other forms of qualitative research include direct measurement, that is describing what you saw, and utilizing drawn pictures or visualizations to understand study participant perspectives. These methods are complementary and not in competition with each other. Both are needed, quantitative and qualitative, to get a full picture of the situation. We should note that prior to beginning either one of these types of studies, one should do some literature review to see what has already been done in the area. A literature review may be all the research that is necessary in some cases, but in other cases, it can provide some general context for more specific follow-up studies. Whether performing quantitative or qualitative research, social research has some basic steps. First, you must decide what general questions you are trying to answer in the population of interest. Second, you'll need to decide how to collect the data. Third, you must develop a plan to collect the data from a representative sample of the population. Fourth, develop the specific questionnaire or interview questions. Fifth, make sure everyone collecting the data, that is the interviewers, have been trained in the collection process so that it can be done consistently. Sixth, try it out on a smaller group to work out the kinks and misunderstandings. Seventh, perform the research, and finally, process the results and draw conclusions. Because sociology studies are human subject research, it is important to recognize that there are ethical and legal requirements to ensure that the study participants are not harmed, know their risks, and responses are confidential. Because of several infamous cases of unethical research, national and international laws, such as the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Belmont Report cover key ethical and legal requirements of studies to prevent abuse of human studies. If you intended to publish your results in some form, and your study participants are providing private, that is non-public, or personally identifiable information, they need to be sure that you follow ethical guidelines. Universities and researchers are required to have independent third-party boards to review their study plan for ethical concerns. Whole courses are available on human subject research ethics, but for this presentation, we'll just cover a few principles. 1. Voluntary. Studies cannot coerce participation, especially if in a captive audience. Further, participants must have informed consent. Participants must know about the procedures, risks, and use of the data before completing the survey. Protection from harm. It must minimize the risk of harm, physical or psychological. This can include unintended consequences that could occur because the responses enabled others to discover their identity or participation. Also, protection of privacy. Assure identifying information will not be made available to anyone not directly involved in the study. Study participants must give permission for sharing their research beyond the specific study. The goal is that you respect the participants as autonomous agents who know what they're getting into by participating. You'll need to be on the lookout for ways in which you can introduce bias into your research through sampling and your questions. Here are some examples. One is a non-representative sample. That is when your sample is not representative of the population you're seeking to study. Consider screening questions to sift out non-target audience, such as the county that they inhabit if you're looking at a watershed plan. Beware of population bias due to format, that is the time, location, or the medium. It matters where you collect the surveys as well as the medium. For instance, not everyone has access online or traffics your website, and your results may be different at the country club versus the thrift store. Also beware of response bias, that is, leading questions or expected responses. You want to balance positively and negatively worded questions to avoid expected responses. People want to get the right answer and will be looking for that expected response. The adjective dead parking lots versus living habitats biases respondents. It's obvious that you're looking for that living answer. Beware of questions and the response order as well. In an online survey, you can make these random. Respondents may also deny their undesirable traits to look more socially favorable. In other words, people may not be truthful about littering when it is framed as a taboo, as in that question example. Perhaps frame this as a frequency in which they toss out trash. Also, avoid leading questions or extra information. And also, you want to avoid misinterpreting questions. Beware of double-barrel questions in which you ask two things at the same time. For instance, in this example question, people may see the benefits to recreation and health differently if they're evaluating a stream. Also, be sure rating labels are clear and unbiased. The example provided below is an imbalanced scale where there is only one negative response, one neutral response, and 4 positive responses. You might be wondering how many responses you need to receive to get a valid survey. SurveyMonkey has a quick survey size calculator that can help you to determine that. You may not need statistical significance if you're trying to get general feedback, but if you're seeking to characterize a target audience, you will. Not having statistical significance does not mean that you are not still receiving valuable information. Here's an example of the target audience responses needed based on the audience size. This table is taken from the Social Indicator Planning and Evaluation System for Non-Point Source Management, a handbook on watershed projects, which is a great resource for planning social survey collection. One thing that you might notice is that you need about the same number of responses for an audience size of 10,000 as 100 million. Particularly if your audience is small, you need to think through your needs. Notice that you need to send mail surveys to over 80% of the audience at a small sample size of 750 to get the number of target responses for a statistically representative survey. For mail surveys, you'll either need the specific addresses of your target audience, or you might utilize a mailing route that reaches your audience. The U.S. Postal Service has the Every Door direct mail service that can be used to deliver to an entire mail route. Through this service, you will be given the mailing cost in advance and some demographics of the area. The small map in the top right shows how you can select the routes. Make sure to include a self-addressed stamp envelope and consider a giveaway or reward to incentivize responses. Some of the pros of a mail survey is that it can reach a large audience and it can reach those without internet. But the cons are the costs for the printing and mailing. It requires to hand enter the results, and there's often a low response rate that's typically biased towards more interested people. Intercept surveys are so called because they intercept people as they go about their other business and ask the people if they want to take part in a survey. They are most effective when the respondents can see topic-related visuals such as a map or an informational display to show credibility, and if they're conducted in a high-traffic area. Surveyors must ask permission if administered in front of a business, survey each person separately and away from others, and not discuss the response options so as to introduce bias, but just read them and have them fill them out on a tablet or paper form. The pros of an intercept survey is that it can be very quickly conducted by different interviewers at different locations. It's low cost, and analyzing the results is relatively easy. The cons is that it is often not representative due to a small sample size. Online surveys can take multiple formats, including an email, social media, or even putting out postcards with QR links to a site. There are very low-cost options. You can use Google Forms to develop a survey, or SurveyMonkey, or other outlets that are out there. But they are biased to an audience that has internet access. As a pros, these online surveys are anonymous, they're very flexible, and you can even save time through bypass questions. They're very easy and low cost to set up, and the data are already electronic, so it makes processing the results a lot easier. As a con, you don't have an interviewer that's present, and so you miss some of the nonverbal responses to the survey. You also need to have screening questions because the whole world can access the site. And it's hard to reach some populations that are not online or in a location where there's poor internet reception or other reasons. There are studies that have evaluated how long surveys should be. What they found is that the more questions you have, the less time people spend in answering those questions. You can see a summary of those results from SurveyMonkey and how the time that's spent decreases. Also, you might see a drop in completion rates if the survey takes too long to complete. Although some feel like once they commit to start a survey, they have to finish, and so long-form surveys can also be effective. If you're doing an intercept or an online survey, it is recommended that it takes no longer than 15 minutes to complete. To provide some examples of quantitative surveys, we want to look at a survey conducted by the Chesapeake Bay on citizen stewardship indicators, as well as an adaptation of these methods that was used by Headwaters and the Kentucky Water Resources Institute in Whitesburg, Kentucky. The Chesapeake Bay study was very large, using a final total of 5,200 randomly selected residents across 6 states and Washington, D.C. via phone interviews. This made the results statistically significant at the state level. Here we're going to present the result distribution from an earlier point in the study when they had about 2,000 responses for the purpose of showing the survey methodology. You can interact with the full data set at the website shown on the screen. The survey was rather long based on the time that it took the phone interviewers. It's about 13 minutes, with 77 total questions. Here you can see the categories of the questions that they asked. The study looked at 13 different stewardship indicators, asking 19 different questions. This slide looks at the types of different behaviors that they measured with their questions. So you get an idea of the types of questions that were asked, as well as the scales that were used. We want to show some representative questions. The first type of question is a response scale, in which the answer was a simple yes or no. For instance, in the last several years, have you done this? For instance, reduced an area of grassland by planting native plants. Another question would be a frequency with a 5-point scale. So for each of the following things, please tell if you've never, seldom, sometimes, usually, or always do this. For instance, pick up your dog's waste and dispose of it in the trash. There are also agreement questions using a 5-point scale. So for each of the following statements, please tell me if you strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, are neutral, somewhat agree, or strongly agree. And here's a statement: polluted water affects me personally. And then lastly, there was questions of likelihood. Looking forward over the next year or so, how likely are you to do each of these things using the scale of not likely, somewhat likely, or very likely. As an example, have your septic system inspected or pumped out. Here you can see the responses to the yes or no questions. In this case, most people have recently had their septic system pumped out, but are not utilizing rain barrels. Here you can see an example of behaviors that are arranged according to their frequency and how often people are conducting them. So here you can see very quickly that people are not typically littering or flushing their medicine down the toilet. However, many are fertilizing their lawns and are not careful to keep it off of their driveways. There's also a much lower percentage of those that are picking up litter routinely. So they're not littering, but they're not necessarily picking it up either. The scores were then converted from a 5-point scale to a 100-point scale for comparison and thresholds for engagement levels. So you can see at the bottom how different responses across the 5-point scale were converted over into that 100-point scale and then summed up. And this allows comparison for analyzing different behaviors. Septic system pump out being one of the most frequently engaged in behaviors, whereas rain barrels being empty, that was very infrequent. They were also able to see which behaviors were the most likely to get behavior change. Again, they asked their likelihood of their changing that behavior, and they scaled that on a 100-point scale versus very, somewhat, or not likely. So in this case, getting people to stop littering had the greatest opportunity, whereas getting people to stop using pesticides or herbicides is a much tougher sale. Here you can see that although many people volunteer or give to charities, the percentage of giving to water organization or charities is much lower. Further, only 40% of the audience can name a water organization at all. You can see that most people want to do more to make their waters healthier here, based on their agreement with the response. But few know how to do that on a local basis. And almost no one thinks that they are actually contributing to the problem. So based on these survey results, you get a good idea of, one, what types of behaviors you want to focus on, two, where to target awareness levels, stages of change, how to think about the message, and three, you have baseline data in order to evaluate how to improve your education outreach campaign going forward. For a statewide study, you will probably not be able to conduct something as elaborate as what was done for the Chesapeake Bay. Therefore, we thought we might give you a Kentucky-specific example of how to adapt some of these similar questions and process into a local study. KWRRI worked with Headwaters in Letcher County to evaluate stakeholder views in the area. The surveys were collected in an intercept format by tabling at events. Here's an example of the form that was developed using some of the lessons learned from the Chesapeake Bay study. The form was just 2 pages long and had a paper version as well as an online version, which were the same. You can see that there are some general information questions, including screening questions, and some questions about the impact of different water quality concerns where they live. Also a section on water quality views, in which both positive and negative statements are recorded. For instance, I believe improving the water quality in the streams should be a priority for our community, or bringing attention to water quality problems may have a negative impact on our local economy. These allowed respondents to not be pushed one way or another. And finally, there was a section evaluating their home stewardship, including questions on wastewater systems, stream maintenance, as well as other items not shown here, including animal waste, lawn and garden care, and issues affecting and limiting their personal property management. Here you can see that when processing this data, failing septic systems and straight pipes were rightfully seen as the greatest concern, whereas people were not as concerned about pet waste. One issue that was surprising was how much the community viewed trash as a concern. And so this speaks to the need for the community litter pickup events as a gateway for improved stewardship engagement. These results are not statistically representative due to the small sampling number, but it demonstrates that you can use simple surveys to get very powerful data about your community relatively simply with some planning and forethought. And hopefully these results provide you with some ideas that you can utilize in surveys in your watershed, and you're encouraged to do that. Now we want to transition from quantitative surveys to qualitative research, beginning with interviews. Interviews are semi-structured conversations seeking expanded knowledge. For instance, I might want to know why trash was viewed as a large impact, or understand why people thought oil and gas drilling was a concern, despite data from the watershed showing otherwise. Interviews can tell you how, but not how many. They can provide subjective perspectives, but not an objective view. They can explain why people respond in certain ways, but they cannot predict how they will respond. They make a good complement for these quantitative surveys. Here are some goals of an interview. First, they can help gather process-related information that is not easily observed. For instance, do they feel involved in the process, or that their opinion is valued in the community? Second, understand a participant's unique perspective or interpretations of activities, events, or motivations. These interviews can really help you to dig down in how a person is perceiving things, much more than statistical data can tell you individually. You can also verify information gathered from other sources. Perhaps you've heard it's been rumored, but in an interview that gives you one perspective on the issue. And lastly, it can determine the validity of research-derived conclusions. Maybe you have a literature study that looks at different motivations and issues. You can see whether that applies locally. There are three different types of one-on-one interviews. Informant interviews are expert interviews. So you might want to interview your key stakeholders for examples. An informant interview, your interviewee is already considered an expert. You probably have a relationship with them, but they're going to provide you with some insider information and perspectives that you want to document in an official format. Respondent interviews are a one-time, often random interviews where a standard protocol is used to draw out responses. These are often used as a complement to a quantitative survey. The idea is that you're getting more information, more data, drawing out some of the attitudes and opinions and experiences, again, often complementing those quantitative surveys. And finally, an ethnographic interview might occur by getting perspectives on riparian zones while people are planting trees. It's where someone is embedded in the situation. They're actively engaged in the process, and you take that opportunity to interview with that. So interviewing someone who's walking their dog about pet waste, or understanding water quality views of kayakers during a boat recreational event. It focuses on something that just happened or is happening in the scene. So what are the pros and cons of interviews? Well, on the pro side, you are able to see some of the nonverbal body language and tone, and you may even record through a video some of this process that you can pick up on later. And you can adapt while you're having the interview session. You can adapt your questions so you get more in-depth responses, and you can clarify what they mean by that when the response is ambiguous. As a con, because you are interviewing the person, there's no longer that anonymity there. And oftentimes someone in an anonymous survey, they may be more honest with you. They're also time consuming, and it can require travel or scheduling. And it really depends on how good of an interviewer the person is as far as what kind of results that you get. As an example of how interviews might be utilized in the watershed engagement and management process, the 2019 Paper of the Year Award for the University Council on Water Resources went to researchers in urban Minneapolis who were looking at stakeholder perspectives on the community and water resources. They conducted 25 interviews with stakeholders consisting of water professionals, government officials, and community actors, especially focusing on underrepresented minority populations. Some of these interviews were identified by community recommendations. The survey had 5 parts with a total of 21 questions focused on the role of the individual in the community's needs and assets, planning and water resources, and a feedback mechanism to identify additional community representatives and stakeholders. Here are some of the questions on you and the community. Notice the open-ended questions and the freedom provided to describe the community as a whole and the individual's responsibilities. So, how would you define community? How would you describe your connection? What has been your role? What would you say the best things about the work you do? And what are some of the most challenging things for the work you do in the community? The second section looks at the community needs and assesses it as a whole. Notice that water nowhere enters into the picture at this point. The questions are geared towards just understanding the community first and understanding how it functions. So this is a wide-angle lens. Here's the questions. What would you say are the community's biggest assets? Why are they important? What do you believe are the most pressing needs in the community, and why are those needs important? In the past 5 years, what would you say have been the most significant problems the community has faced? And how effective has the community been at responding to these problems? Why? And can you provide examples? The third section then narrowed in on water resources. These are just a few of those questions. Notice, again, the open-ended nature of the questions and the lack of bias. So, how important are water resources such as local streams and lakes to the quality of life for residents in this community? Is the community actively engaged in land use planning in the watershed? Is the community actively engaged in water resource protection and restoration? And what successes are there? And then again, what challenges and setbacks? Again, these are not all the questions, but are representative of the types of questions that they ask. And based on the results of this interview, 5 different narratives were found amongst the community. Because the study began with considering the larger community issues and concerns, they were able to see that some groups felt disempowered from water-related decision-making, even though the culture shaped interactions with water. Further, they found that often the connection is not made between relevant issues in the community and water resources, and that water was seen as invisible and off limits. This was the case in an urban community. But what about in your local watershed community? Perhaps taking the time to understand the community issues and then tie water issues to them in a more simple, straightforward manner would increase interest and involvement in the community. This gives an example as how interviews could be used to benefit your watershed outreach engagement strategy. Similar to one-on-one interviews in their qualitative approach, focus groups utilize group interactions and discussions to provide feedback on community issues. Often focus groups are selected from survey participants to get a more in-depth understanding of the responses. However, focus groups can also be used prior to surveys to help in their design. One approach to focus groups is to divide into separate groups based on whether they practice a given behavior or not, and to understand what is driving those behaviors. Another approach may be to develop groups based on similar responses to a survey and better understand the views of those respective groups. Often a trained facilitator is helpful to keep the discussion on track and to avoid the extremes or arguments caused by powerful emotions or dominant personalities. They can also help to minimize the role of groupthink by allowing participants to first capture their own thoughts before sharing with the group. The process is that a series of questions are asked in a session for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Sometimes qualitative surveys can be mixed in with the open questions. These sessions are often recorded to get the nonverbal responses as well as the verbal ones. If you would like additional guidance on focus groups, we recommend consultation with an excellent guidance document developed by NOAA, available through the link below. This is an example of a checklist of items to perform in hosting a focus group. We include this as a resource for later reference if you were planning to host a focus group. Beginning some 4 months in advance is often necessary to properly conduct the study. As an example of a focus group, in 2012 to 2013, a study was conducted by KWRRI and funded by the Division of Water to understand stakeholder views about nutrient management in the Floyd's Fork watershed in the Salt River Basin. This study began with a series of listening sessions to understand the perspectives and compositions of different groups, and then focus studies with the groups to determine their preferences on various nutrient BMPs, as well as life goals, values, and trusted information sources. 7 different stakeholder groups emerged from the listening sessions, including developers, preservation, environmental, agricultural, recreational, government, and residents. During the focus sessions, real-time feedback was provided on various issues, and then the group discussed their answers. Here you can see how various groups responded differently to 4 of the 20 practices examined. The blue bars are the average, green is the median, and red is the standard deviation in the responses, based on a 9-point Likert scale of support. You can see that, in the top left, eliminating failing septic systems was supported across the board. Some of the comments included, quote, obviously anybody would want failing septic systems corrected for the area. Quote, potential problems with the strategy will always be the cost and then compliance, basically getting people to do this. On the top right, we see that crop or fertilizer management was supported by all groups except for developers and recreational groups. Some of the quotes include, quote, well, I think the strategy represents a good idea and something to be considered as a way of managing some of the influence of nutrients getting into the streams as far as just in general. As compared to things like housing development and other infrastructure, I think, but you would know better than I, that fertilizers and agriculture uses have a much more tremendous impact on streams nearby. Another quote, I don't think the Division of Water has any control over what the farmers do. One of the disadvantages of the strategy also is political, the control of the agricultural interests, you know. It's pretty important to have food growing in the United States, I guess locally or regionally, and it would simply be a pretty tall mountain, I think, to climb to get many changes legislatively. In the bottom left, we see that most groups were in favor of reducing urban runoff, but developers scored the practice much lower. Quote, we simply don't have that much impermeable surfaces at this point in time, so there are other methods with greater effect. And quote, I'm not against it. It's just that, you know, some of the permeable pavement, the ones with the grass that grows between it, they did that whole thing down at the waterfront where they had the mat down and they were supposed to grow up so they could drive on it. If you don't manage it right, the grass dies. Quote, I mean, people like a nice, clean driveway. They don't want to see weeds in their driveway. In the bottom right, we see pollution trading was rejected by most of the groups. Quote, it could allow some nutrient sources not to make any or little effort to resolve their infrastructure and plant capacity inadequacy. Quote, they're saying, I didn't pay somebody else to implement, or I can pay someone else to implement. And quote, I really just don't think that sounds ethical to me. Something's not right about it. And quote, there's not been a successful cap and trading program since acid rain. Once the grant money ran out for carbon trading programs, the organizers cashed out and it dissolved. So you can see this is some of the benefit of getting perspectives and combining a quantitative approach with some of the qualitative responses on why the community scored different practices in the way that they did. A listening session or community forum is a little bit different from a focus group in that it is more open-ended and less focused. Basically, you hold a session where the audience is prompted to speak. You want to hear their views. This can be a good starting place for working in a community. The goal is to get feedback on issues and concerns, barriers, resources, and different solutions. However, these types of events typically attract the most interested and active stakeholders. Direct observation is another qualitative survey approach. in which the researcher observes people engaging or not engaging in behavior. They may record what caused the behavior, how much effort was exerted, or what other behaviors were associated with it. Obviously, respecting people's privacy is important, so this should be done in a public place, lest it be viewed as invading privacy. Hopefully, it can provide some insight into what people are actually doing as opposed to what they say they are doing. However, the results are often anecdotal, and it can be time-consuming to conduct this type of observation. Social mapping can be used to create drawings that illustrate social dynamics, such as possible issues and problems, causes and effects, and relationships between organizations and individuals. They can be developed through your in-person gatherings, surveys, or other data analysis. There are four main types of social maps. That is, asset maps, cognitive maps, concept maps, and social maps. We're going to be taking a look at each of these in kind. An asset map can show the assets or resources that various individuals or groups in the community could contribute to solving a water quality problem. This example shows how community groups and entities can contribute to the success of a park and what they can receive from it. A cognitive map is a drawing created by the community members that can help visualize how they view and perceive their surroundings. You can learn what people see as the most important elements of the community and where they spend most of their time, which may be helpful in determining where to distribute your message. Concept maps can help identify perceived relationships between causes and the effects of environmental problems, such as a linkage between land use and water quality problems. By asking community members to draw a map of some of the areas where non-point source contributions may be occurring, you can see where stereotypes may be, what perceptions might serve as barriers to change, and where you may need to focus your campaign's efforts. Finally, a social network map will help you to learn how information is delivered through your target audience. Participants sketch out their own personal networks of communication and compare them with others. You can then tailor your information distribution methods based on this exercise. We've looked at 4 different types of social mapping types. What do you think might be the largest obstacle to conducting these types of mapping activities? The reality is, the need for group participation with enough diverse participants to provide a broad range of perspectives is often the most difficult obstacle in order to make these a meaningful contribution to your understanding of the target population. The US EPA Region 5 Great Lakes Regional Social Indicators Team developed the Social Indicator Planning and Evaluation System for Non-Point Source Management, a handbook for watershed projects. This is a guide to help through watershed-specific survey-related items. It also has a tool to help you build surveys and ask the right question. The guide covers much more than we are able to address during this presentation, so we recommend that you reference it for next steps in how to build your social surveys in order to influence and inform your social outreach campaigns. And at this point, we'd love to take your feedback and questions as to how you received this presentation. We'd love to know what the survey says. If we were to survey 100 watershed coordinators, what is your reaction to this presentation? Please feel free to contact us at our website to give us some additional information about your problems, concerns, or your use of this presentation. Thank you very much.